Namaste, Professor Chaitra, and welcome to this podcast.
Namaste.
Thank you so much for taking time for this very important and timely topic, which is the idea of how do we bring Indic thought more into organizations, especially Seva organizations, service organizations. And I remember meeting you and then also having a very rich conversation with you where several ideas came up, and I really felt these ideas should already start reaching organizations where people can start taking them, implementing them, practicing them. And so the intent of the podcast was to invite you to share some of those. And and I remember of everything that we spoke, the thing that stayed the most with me was when you mentioned that if our land can come up with religions or be the source of religions that have lasted and traditions which have lasted for hundreds of years, why can't we take those same elements in our organizations and create lasting organizations? So I was curious to if you could start with your observations about this and where does it come from?
Thank you, Abhishek. See, just to put things in perspective, I had no intention of working on the nature of organizations. But then once I started, 15 years back, seriously taking Indian traditions and how various domains of human existence are managed by Indian tradition, there is something phenomenally striking started to appeal. On the one hand, if you look at our traditions, we have a whole number of, for instance, the Bhakti tradition, you have Matha Parampara, there are Akhadas, you know. So some of them span to, 1500 years, 1600 years, and some of them 600 years, 700 years. There has been constant sustenance, of whole range of activities, including ritual. Ritual is one aspect of it, but the nature of building relationship with the society and inter-individual relationship and inculcating certain values, and which also involves a large amount of economic activity, whole range of things. On the one hand, is sustained, despite the all turmoils, changes that have occurred in 1000 years. The nature of governance and administrations, everything changed, yet the sustenance of these traditions continue to exist on the one hand. On the other hand, in last 1 century, and more so with last 80 years, India's independence history, so we have a new way of managing our affairs. So there is a Indian state expressed through Indian government, and you have series of laws pertaining to various domains. And we have a formal way of creating organizations. And interestingly, there are two important things that actually determine the nature of this modern day organization. One, largely they appear to be centered around an individual, and an individual disappears, the system, though in a very lower level, survives. These organizations will start breaking. Something else would come there. Now, second important thing is that we are unable to manage. How do we act to sustain an organization? What should be the nature and function of an organization? These questions rarely become part of the reflection. So I can go on listing hundreds of organizations. Societies have come, trusts have come, independent movements have come. They thrive for about 40 years, 50 years around one character, whether it is commercial organization, seva organization. So today, in last 1 century experience that we think about, organizations seem to be very temporary. They seem to be disappearing, with all these new laws, the new ways of learning to, deal with. And the third important part that I see is a very interesting kind of a phenomena to observe. On the one hand, with the lot of experience with the corporate governance, the way to manage an organization, there is an attempt to professionalize this organization. So there are any number of HR trainers and organizational development trainers. They have been trying to do something, and more you try to bring them. These organizations seem to be getting into some kind of decision paralysis, and they does not seem to be going anywhere. They're unable to take off. So therefore, there is this very interesting kind of a situation that we are today. the one hand, there is this traditional organization, they know how to manage themselves, they still continue to flourish, thrive, and survive. On the other hand, we have created a new organization with great commitment and intent, to make some transformation, but they do not seem to be long lasting, they do not seem to be sustainable. So therefore, how do we reflect about some of this problem, has become an interesting question. So this is exactly the background within which I was, trying to share my experience with multiple organizations that I have been dealing with. And I myself run some organizations, and I work and help multiple organizations. So there is a problem, and every time when you look at these problems, now every organization will come up with one or the other explanation of why such a thing is not happening and what should be done to resolve that crisis. And invariably all these solution does not seem to be solving the problems that we have. And most of the solutions that we think that how do we make an organization sustainable may be helpful for some time, for a few years, but then organizations will go back to their same old ways of functioning, and they do not seem to be seeing a future pathway. So this is a broad, contour within which I wanted to, bring it to your attention, since you are also in the same space. You're more specialized and practically engaged with. So that is where the background is.
Thank you for sharing, Professor. Uh, I also got in touch with an essential paradox at the heart of Indian organizations, modern Indian organizations, I feel, because some parts of these organizations to me seem to be modeled on an extractive kind of East India Company management kind of thing, where shareholders are cheering you for how much extraction and hoarding you did. And there is that layer. And then there is the Indic dharmic layer of saying that the organization is supposed to serve the society and it's actually there for all its stakeholders, and its value has to flow into the society. It should keep a small share but really enhances society. And of course there are some organizations that have been able to resolve that contradiction. I feel like, for example, maybe Tata has put in a bunch of their money into trusts and actually kind of brought the alignment between society and profit. But I wonder if the modern Indian manager also today kind of faces this contradiction of being brought up in a family structure and brought up with certain values and ways of being. And then modernity and professionalism asks him or her to be a very different person, like a very compartmentalized person, not bringing his whole self. So curious about this contradictions and paradoxes that show up. Is that a fair reading, and are those also where the energy of our culture is stuck?
Now, I see you are hitting on the nail. I mean, this is where the heart of the problem lies. But it is not as simple as it is being formulated. Now, your observations are absolutely correct. Now, on the one hand, we have a particular way of being in this world. So every Indian, whether you are a Kashmiri or a Tamilian or a Kannadiga, so you have a particular way of sharing your resources, caring for others. You share their emotions, and you have certain ideas. What is Papa? What is Punya? What is Dharma? What is Bhrashta? You have this series of conception within which your upbringing is shaped. Even if you are very ultra metropolitan brought up, then also you are part of a larger milieu where these are very common resonating ideas within which you know how to connect with another person. Now, second, once you start running an organization with whatever, whether it is a profit making organization or a non profit making organization, you are bound by certain rules and regulations. Now, these rules and regulations would actually tell you to series of compliance procedure, certain ways of disbursing the money, certain ways of accounting for things, and there is a system which has been built. Now, the problems that we encounter is that on the one hand, you have to deal with these rules and regulations, which are not really built around the ideas within which we are brought up. So there is some kind of a background history that I wanted to come back repeatedly in this conversation. Now, to put it in a very simple line, the rules and regulations that we have, are not really congenial to our experiential way of dealing with this world. So now you are in a dilemma. One, you have an intent, you have persuaded some people to put in money, you've asked some people to volunteer, you've hired some people to whom you wanted to pay salaries, etc., because you have to run a structured organization. And the laws around it, whether it is the Company Act, whether it is the Charitable Act, or whether any other compliance which is required through the auditing processes that you follow, is pushing you in one direction, and your ways of doing things and organizing yourself is in other direction. A large number of people, including myself, we tend to strike a balance between my ways of doing thing versus the way that you wanted to comply with the law. Now, as a consequence, what happens, whether it is a business corporation in India, I have met and spoken to a large number of CEOs, to mid-level managers, to all of them. So if you go and look at their company reports or the organization reports, etc., they're perfect in terms of bookkeeping. Okay, all the documentation, etc., it is necessary. And if you ask them, they will describe you this procedure. But the way organization operates is completely different. So in a way, you have to do this. You act in a particular way, and because there is an organizational demand, the compliance demand that you have, for which you have learned a way of presenting yourself in a particular way. In fact, one of the observation that many people outside India, specifically Europe and Americans, when they come and see, they find it quite perplexing. In fact, some people would see these are very hypocritical, they have double standards, all this. But in the same light, they will also come back and say, Indians are very trustworthy. If they give word, irrespective of whether you sign an agreement or not, once the word is given, they stick to it. So this kind of descriptions, emerge, when you describe an organization, whether it is a business corporation or whether it is a seva organization or any kind of organization that you are interested in doing. Now, any number of shortcuts that Indians have been trying to find in every generation to skip the clutches of these rules and regulation that governs. So the underlying idea, which is very central, is that the rules and regulations that governs how an organization should be managed and the way that we know how to deal with this world and the people, they are not even in sync with each other. So this actually creates a profound discomfort, and therefore it's very difficult. So the moment, every time the new leadership change, the new successor comes into being, everything had to be redone, because most of it are not written. These are based on trust managed, but only in terms of presenting every year you have to do an auditing. By then you do every compliance, show it in the book. So therefore there is no transmission of this experience of running an organization from one generation to another generation. So, I mean, one very external manifestation through the law that I was referring to would actually compel us to redo many things which we are not comfortable, which is actually at the heart of the crisis that we have.
Let me kind of also request you to open up the last thing that you shared, but also let me paraphrase a bit, because also I'm hearing like two kind of worlds almost. One feels like a very sterile rule based world where letter is everything and everything is controlled and that's kind of imposed, and the other is a more contextual, fluid, trust based world where there is discretion and there is almost like a buffer to respond to what is contextual and almost trust. Like there's almost like, to me it feels like there's breathing space. It's not so tight, and it's contextual. I think that's what's coming to me, and I feel like this has been imposed on top of this, like the sterile rule based ways of being imposed on top. But life anyways continues contextually. Everybody in India also knows, like there is accounting compliance, but the way things actually work has this sense of approximation. So this rule based order hasn't been able to uproot this ways of being. In fact, it's created this strange combination. I guess that's how I'm kind of sense making what you're sharing. And yeah.
No, I wouldn't actually take this route of describing the problem. In fact, many have made an attempt to describe this way.
Hmm, hmm,
See, there is every part of the world, there is some contextual decision making that happens.
hmm, hmm,
whether you run an organization in Europe, whether you run an organization in India. So therefore, that is not the central issue. Now you cannot say that in Europe an organization would sit and plan every single thing next minute what is going to happen is definitely not the case. But one of the questions that we should be asking is that what exactly is the nature of this difference that we are seeing? And this requires some kind of a thinking which a large number of thinkers in India are reluctant to engage with. They're interested in finding an ad hoc solution to the problem because kaam chalana hai. So you have to get that and you don't think about it. So let me start sketching briefly. Probably we can get into the details of it. Now let me put it like this. Now, the current model of governance and administration that we have, which demands the Indian society, people in India had to function in a particular way, is not our way of functioning in the world. There is a history to these financial audit institutions in India, and they did not come into being overnight. Now, they actually started, taking shape and form with the experience Europe had by 18th century. And these are precisely the European institution. Late 18th century, they started establishing courts in India. Early 19th century, companies started making certain ways of managing people. And by 1863, you are part of the colonial, state. And the entire governance. So there is legal institution, and there is financial institutions, and there is this management of public institution. All these ideas started taking shape from the 19th century onwards, and it became aggressive by the time you reached the end of 19th century. So by the beginning of the 20th century, we have colonial state established. Okay. Now what we did was in India, that when India became independence, we inherited these institutions. Of course, we did not exactly inherit in the way that it was handed over to us. We did minor modification. We kept on making corrections as and when challenges come, and people started bringing. Not that nobody has thought about it. I mean, people started thinking, and as and when there were challenges, they were trying to correct it. So one of the most fundamental problem is what are the nature of these institutions that we have today is the fundamental question that we should be asking to ourselves. Now, when European institutions came and they started taking in India, don't even assume that they saw there were rajas in Bharat, and because of rajas they modified some institutions, some structures, etc. They didn't do that. What they simply created is an uniform overarching colonial institution. And this institution of how to govern, how to administer a population is part of the experience that Europe had in their part of the world. Now, for them, I wouldn't say that this is a conspiracy or some kind of divide and rule. That's not the position that I would say take. There are a lot of good people also in colonial period who wanted to help Indians, etc. There were bad people as well. I mean, all kinds of people were there. There are all kinds of agendas. There was no one single agenda. There are multiple agendas, the people who were involved in setting up this institution. But in a nutshell, they had an experience of managing and administering their part of the world. So these were institutions which were there in Europe, and they were migrated to India. Now, what we have not understood is that when institutions of one culture migrates to another culture, can they be simply implanted straight away? Now, that requires some kind of a deeper thinking about the nature of institutions itself. Now, in any place, how do institutions come into being in society? Now, these institutions don't think that somebody writes a scientific theory and we build no, it never happens in that way. Now we build institution out of, you keep dealing with your world, and every given point in time you face certain challenges in the world. And once you see the challenges in the world, you keep making, improvising, adopting, experimenting, etc. That's how institutions get standardized over a period of time. So therefore, what is the purpose of this institution? How does it deal with people? All these questions are associated with the institution and the culture within which it has been, originated and developed further. When it came to India, there are many parts of the things. First of all, there was an assumption within the Europeans that the culture had no significant impact on the migration of these institutions. So that's why they were under the impression that what works for us should also work for other part of the world. Now, what was not known then was that in different parts of the world, different ways of going about the world exist. Therefore, that requires different kind of reflection on what institutions are appropriate. Now, that didn't happen. So, just to stretch, I will come back to this point about cultural difference is an important question. But before that, I wanted to point out when they came here, see, the idea of institution in Europe, for example, you create an institution. Now, irrespective of which person comes into being in that place, institution has certain goals and therefore there are certain functions. Now, once you put the institution in place and familiarize the people, no matter whether you are an intelligent person or a mediocre person, now the institution will continue to function. Right? Now, in this model in European society, these institutions still function. There are institutions like universities, for instance. They have been functioning for 800 years, 900 years, 600 years. Not that they have been retained in the same fashion, they have modified. And at ease, people can function with those institutions in their part of the world. Once the same institutions came to this part of the world, now we did not ask in last 150, 180 years, what kind of institutional structure is necessary for the people of our culture. What we have been consistently trying to do is that there is an institution in place and we keep modifying with some ad hoc understanding, and we keep every good intention, every modification that has been brought in had a just idea, had a good feeling about it, good intention. In 5 years, it makes it very painful. Now, that is our experience of dealing with most of these public institutions. So therefore, now these institutions that we are trying to engage with were not meant to deal with this population. They were meant for somebody else. It was part of the experience of somebody else. So when colonial administrators came, now they have built it here. They had anxieties of managing this place, and all their anxieties, all their ideas were transformed into standard operating procedures of this institution. I will just give you an interesting example, and probably then we can take it further for the conversation. Now, most of our financial transactions that we do in this organization, now the kind of procedures that we have put in place for auditing and the compliance does not necessarily look at whether the money that you have brought in is used for the goals for which it was brought in, but rather you are more focused on whether it is exactly billed. So there is some kind of a trust deficit which was there part of the colonial institution. I can guarantee you, even in 2026, our entire auditing and finance management system functions on trust deficit. It does not trust its own people. I will give one example. I had one professor from Karnataka, who was a state university professor. Okay, he was teaching here, and he was terrified by the auditing, billing. The university professors are really scared because there are huge compliance that you have to get into. So he went to Oxford. He was offered, teaching position sometime in Oxford for a couple of years. So when he was there, so he was asked to go to a conference in Manchester from London. He was in Oxford, and when he traveled, so he went to the conference, he came back, and after a couple of months, there was a call from the finance section of the university and asking him, Professor, did you go to this conference? Yes, I did. Why did you not claim reimbursements? Then he said, see, look, I went there, I caught a train, I went, and I don't have tickets in my hand. So because I don't have tickets, how can I claim reimbursement? Then the response was, Professor, you went there, right? Yes, I went there. So did you go and present whatever you're supposed? I did that, and you came back. We trust you, Professor. You can just tell us that you have done it and just send me the necessary declaration, and we will do the payment. Now, on the contrary, if it were to be the same situation in India, do you have the ticket? Did you book it from IRCTC? Did you book? I mean, you give that screenshot. This now, for example, in many institutions, you say you book a flight ticket, and did you have the boarding pass? So the argument from the finance is that we know, sir, you are very honest. We have no question about your financial integrity, because there are a lot of people who cheat. So the first way of looking at the compliance is to say that you basically not trustworthy. Therefore, I need to monitor you. I need to regulate you. Now, this is the kind of tension which was there, part of the colonial anxiety, gets transmitted here. But when we, as ourselves, for example, deal with each other, look at our ways of dealing with finances. So most often when we handle, somebody comes and asks, urgently, I need some money. You don't even care to look at some writing pronote or anything else. We actually, on the basis of trust, we actually deal with many things. Now, one dimension that I just pointed out to you on a very practical scale, that this creates a huge point. So you need to create a staff, you need to create an entire mechanism which is only bothered about monitoring whether this has come, that has come. Now, this is a huge hindrance for normal, free-flowing, moving people. So it is not simply about the spending money or not. It is about whether you trust somebody or not. Now, technically speaking, Abhishek, I trust you. But when I am dealing with you in an organization, now, despite how much of a confidence I have in you, the nature of institution is such that I have to start with the premise that you're not trustworthy. Now, see, this is the kind of dilemma within which we actually operate in this world. And I wanted to say why such dilemmas come into being, etc., later if need be. But this is the point that I was sketching, that there is something fundamental problem about the nature of institutions that we are dealing.
What I'm hearing, Professor, from what you shared is that the issue goes several levels deeper. It is not just about rules being imposed on a contextual thing, but a very fundamental what are institutions meant to be, and hence what are structures and what are fundamental assumptions of these institutions. I think that's what I'm hearing, that the issue is several layers deeper than just surface level kind of clash of cultures kinds. I would love for you to elaborate what you were sharing, but I was also curious that then if we start from the very first principles, saying in our culture, what is the purpose of an institution? What is the nature of the institution? What are the founding kind of, I don't know, assumptions of the institutions that have lasted? Love to hear if that is one area, or you could go into why these dilemmas exist. I mean, both would be interesting.
I mean, I think it is worthwhile to go back and say, what is that which makes us different? And why is that there is this incompatibility
Sure.
between the institutions and ideas that actually govern us today and the way we function in this world? It's very important to make this distinction, contrast, and understood. So one of the claims that I'm making is that these institutions which are creating problems to us are not necessarily simple institutional problem. It is the product of how institution of one particular culture is superimposed on another culture without taking into account the differences in the culture. So that requires some more elaboration. I mean, if you look at the contrast set, now there are two cultures. For instance, we can start with an argument in our context. One is the Western culture, which is you can call it European culture, Western culture, whatever. Now, I'm making very generic kind of claim to make the things clear. And there is another Indian culture. In both these cases, I'm not really sticking to the political boundaries of today, nor of the political boundary, because it is about the way people exist in the world. Now, when we look at what constitute culture and how do we look at cultural difference, there is one fundamental crisis about which last 20, 30 years, some people, specifically my guru, Professor S. N. Balgangadhara, raised a very important question. See, he starts his inquiry with this very profound question. See, today when we look at differences in the world, there are all kinds of differences. There are sociological differences that I can talk about. I belong to some jati, you belong to some jati, you belong to one region, I belong to another region, therefore we have sociological differences. And there are psychological differences between two individuals, and then there are biological differences that we carry. All these are explainable, understandable. But the one thing that we have not reflected very deeply is what makes some difference into cultural difference, not biological, sociological, or psychological difference. This is the question. When he started inquiring, he started looking at, what is culture. I mean, in the marketplace of ideas, now what is culture? There are hundreds of definitions. Way back, as early as something like 2000s, somebody did a review of the definitions of culture. I mean, it is some, 150, around 150 definitions are available in the marketplace. Now, I'm not getting into this jugglery of different definitions, and I'm not interested in making a kind of literature review around it. What I am interested in, when we say that there are differences in the culture, what exactly is that we are referring to? Now, if you focus on that, now all these definitions can be made sense of. Now, one of the most fundamental difference that we have is the way we learn to go about this world. Now, if you look at as human beings, all of us are capable of learning in all possible ways. Because learning is a human species property, not, Indian versus European. But unfortunately, if you look at the world, every human being does not learn every possible learning strategies. And even if he learns to use them, there is a particular configuration within which there is different proportion within which different kinds of learning strategies gets used. Now, in this background, if you make a contrasting difference between Indian culture versus the European culture, now Indian culture is more performative, more action oriented, more practical. So therefore, even when they write texts, even when they write theories, even when they, write very serious philosophical treatises, they're more associated with performances. So the dominant mode of learning, the configuration of learning that the Indian culture has is predominantly performative, for which the theoretical is subordinated to. If you look at the European culture, now it is predominantly theoretical learning. Even the practical is subordinated to. Just to make a contrast set. Now, in our tradition, now throughout India, you go and see hundreds of people. Okay, they are engaged in some ritual or the other. They belong to some puja paddhati, there are family traditions, there are intellectual tradition. You're part of all that. Somebody is a follower of Sadhguru, somebody is that, somebody is this. Now, if you look at our actions of whether you're meditating, you're doing puja part, etc., why are you doing this if you ask them? Now, they will tell you some story. Some would even want to, some modern apologetics would even defend the science behind this action, etc., which of course, I mean, doesn't make much sense to me. But why do we do that if you push it very seriously? He said, this is how we do in our tradition. Because it is transmitted through ancestors. So the performances, the actions that we do. So now the my part of Karnataka where you live, so within Brahmins you have Madhva, and then you have Vishishtadvaitins and Advaitins, and then there are different communities. If you ask, all of them have different ways of doing things. Somebody would put tilak, somebody would put kumkum, somebody would put namam. And if you ask why of them, finally if you push them harder, they will say, this is what we have been doing for generations. This is what you know how to do. And you don't need any greater explanation than saying that this is what we have learned, because our ancestors have standardized, they have practiced it, and they have got what they're supposed to get out of it. So therefore, action, our tradition has practiced this itself is a legitimate reason why you act. On the contrary, if you look at the European cultures, now there you need a description of why you are doing this action. So they have to go and find a belief system. They have to find a doctrine. They have to find a an explanation to it. And there is huge amount of debate in saying whether this is the right practice or not. In fact, such kind of question doesn't appear to us. There is nothing called right or wrong practice. Now, you do it perfectly or you don't do it. And if you are not doing in accordance with your family tradition, some elder would come and point out, this is not how we do in our family. Others might do other way, but in our family or in our tradition, we do it differently. In the sense, this actually generates an entirely different way of going about the world. So if you look at one of the Advaita traditions like Shankara Mathas, which are there for thousands of years, and the devotees continue to practice their traditions for I don't know how many generations, I can't even calculate. And they have been continuously doing it, and they have been sustaining to do this. Or look at our temple traditions. There, I mean, you come to southern part of India, temple traditions span back to thousands of years. Now, if you go back there, why is that the same rituals have been transmitted? Every year you keep doing it. I mean, I have seen, for example, in Karnataka near Bangalore, there are any number of temples where you get the epigraphs where there is a description of how rituals are done in the epigraphs, and kings have given grants to them. Even today, you go, the same kind of rituals are repeated. So what we do is that we transmit actions. So the entire training to be part of a tradition is to inherit series of practices. This doesn't mean that we don't think about it. Of course, there is a lot of reflection, there is a lot of correction, modification according to time. In fact, traditions gives you a very flexible way of adopting. Now, if you look at the European way, now they keep raising this question about the doctrine, the principle, and you keep hearing. So what you intend to transmit there is not certain specific action, but rather you are series of ideas from one generation to another. Now here we don't make the distinction between the idea and the practice. They are integrated within each other. If you are able to do certain kind of practice, essentially that idea itself carried, that practice itself carried certain idea. And one of the advice that, in the tradition, you get lots of literature which says how to do ritual. All our Bhakti saints to everybody were critical of ritual, because you should focus on why are you doing this ritual. Because it has certain goal, it has certain purposes. And if you simply mechanically start doing ritual, that's not a fair idea. So Shankaracharya would say, Madhvacharya would say, everybody would actually criticize ritual. Not to say you should not do ritual. In fact, they would give series of rituals, series of practices, and the practices had to be taught this way. On the contrary, for example, in Europe, last 1,500 years of history of Europe, if you look at debate, last 1,000 years is very specifically, the practices and the tradition is something which is hated in the European culture. So they think that it is part of the human errors would come into being, because they have a model of looking at the church as a community. Now, so the words of God has to be acted in this world, and we didn't carry that. Now, we had a completely opposite way. For example, even the word like Shastra, when we talk about in our tradition, now my part of the country, so we use this word doing Shastra. So it is not referring to some book or doctrine. In fact, doing Shastra itself is exactly doing this practice in this way or not. Now, these are completely two different ways of going about this world. Right? Now, once you have these two different ways of going about this world, I can make it very light in understanding. Just to take a personal experience with my collaborators in Europe and what kind of experiences that I had. Now, think about buying a TV to your house. Let's say we buy a good smart TV, with all updated gadgets, YouTube, internet connected, AI driven, all that you can do. Now, the moment you get the TV, how do you operate it? Now, you simply call up another friend of yours who has installed such a TV, and you will be putting your phone and you will be operating remote and settle it in half an hour, and you will practice it multiple times, and every time you run into a problem, you call somebody who knows it and settle it. And you will probably 95%, 98% of Indians, when you buy a TV, you wouldn't even open that user manual. Right? This is how we do things. And if you go to a European, my friends, whenever they used to come from Europe, when they used to buy gadget, and if some of us used to go and intervene and say, look, I can help you how to do it, and they used to get annoyed. And so they would sit, spend time, and use. They are very comfortable using user manuals, and they follow the instruction using user manual, and they do it by themselves. So these are very different ways to look at the world. So there is a complaint on Indians, which is a very funny kind of complaint. In a sense, on the one side, we have been told that Indians are very bad at documenting. But on the other hand, we have been also told that Indians have written millions of books. Now, this points out to something very interesting. Not that we were uninterested in writing. There are certain things, because you have the process transmitted, and you use these books and other ideas to reflect once you do the practice. If you look at most of the traditional texts, shastras, etc., once you learn to practice, then these texts are useful. For example, nobody would learn music by reading the treatise on music. They will spend years first learning with the guru. Once you excel in music, the guru will start guiding you. You read these texts. They will help. So nobody would compose a poetry by reading Bharata's Natya Shastra, or nobody would learn dance by looking at Bharata's Natya Shastra. So there is a different way in which we organize ourselves. So the difference in culture is the way we look at the world, differently. Now, their ways of looking at the world is shaped by their cultural transmission. That this is how, why that way has to be done, why this way has to be done, there is no answer. There is nothing superior and inferior about it. For Europeans, they have trained themselves for thousands of years. It's perfectly reasonable. And all these institutions about which we are referring to now do not simply work in India, but they work fantastically in those places. They are flourishing there.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they simply do not work, should indicate to this point that our crisis that we have today, even though Europeans are not governing us, they are not administering us, but our crisis is in this difference in looking at the institutions. So though colonialism has gone, Europeans have gone out, but their institutions have remained. The institutions have specific goal. Now there is worse thing that has happened. Now, because Europeans are not running these institutions, now what are the goals of these institutions, and to whom these goals of these institutions are important? We don't know. And second, see, now you come back and say, in corporate world, I have recently heard that your experience had to be transmitted. And I went and heard some people helping. Now, more or less, the modern day people who train Indian workforce, whether in the non-profit or the profit organization, they are interested in transmitting the principles. Okay, now very recently they have been going towards case studies and best practices, etc. But then also the focus is culling out some principle and actually inculcating that principle, which does not seem to be working. Now, what is seemed to be in our experience working is you transmit practice itself in a very different way. Now, so we are very good. I mean, so I used to be biologist once upon a time. And, every time when I used to talk about climate and environment crisis, the Indian audience would sit and listen to me. Okay, very meticulously, they take down notes, everything. At the end, they will ask me question. Tell me, what should I do? Now, then every time I used to be very puzzled. I spoke 1 hour with so much of research, put everything. And could you not draw what you should do out of what I have given? Now, that's not the way we think. Not that they're less intelligent people. Our ways of going about this world is, I need this way of functioning. So we are very good in, copying best practices. Now, this is, I'm sure, you have more exposure than me in dealing with multiple organizations. Once you set up one best practice, there will be 100 organizations to copy that way. But see, the unfortunate crisis today for us is because of this institution and lack of our understanding of what kind of people are we do not know how to copy these practices. Unlike the Shankara tradition, Madhva tradition, Akhadas that I was referring to, they have absolutely no problem in transmitting their tradition. They know how to, you know, pass the practices to the next generation. So how to take certain action from somebody is also well known to them. Again, but we have lost it today. Is the case that I have sketched briefly. I think I took a little longer in explanation. Yeah.
Was fairly important, Professor. I have two questions. I think what you're sharing is fairly
Yeah.
resonant and deep. I think one question is this, where you ended saying that, copying practices, like not creating a best practice manual, transmitting it, translating it, but there must be some doing together. Or I don't know what's the transmission, the word that you use, and how do practices transmit not only across generations, but across contexts. So I think that's one question. And the second question was around exceptions. Say a user manual would talk about how to operate, but would also say what to do when it goes wrong. But in a tradition where you're learning by doing together, and when an unexpected situation comes which you've never handled, how does the transmission of how to deal with exceptions happen? Like, I don't know if that, yeah, those are the two curiosities that are coming to me.
See, if you go for the kind of performative thinking that I am referring to,
Hmm,
now you need to make a conceptual departure from our conventional understanding.
hmm, hmm,
Now, the way we formulate knowledge today is that you have an idea in your head, and this idea gets translated as some action.
hmm, hmm,
Okay, so the only way of knowledge can exist is in the form of this idea, and the idea gets converted into some recognizable practice. Now, this is an assumption that we are making. Okay. Now, if you can act in this world in this way, right? Now, that itself is a knowledge. So, in Indian tradition, interestingly, so on a lighter note, I will bring that for a serious conversation. See, India and China, but largely India, has been alleged to produce jugad. This is a common talk everywhere. For everything, we seem to be, doing jugad. Okay. Now, even though people talk about jugad, etc., there is a pinch of negativity that you carry, when you talk about jugad. But how did these people, who engage in jugad, are successfully be able to do this jugad? Now, this is one important point, but it's because most of the people who are engaged in jugad are not great scholars. They are not great engineers, but they can reproduce technology. So that means if they can act in one particular domain and that action itself is knowledgeable, therefore they can transmit that action in all exceptional condition to all impossible situations. That has been the success story of India.
hmm,
One of the brilliant resilience that we have. So all kind of situations that we come up with new kind of solution at individual, at family level, at societal level, is the fact that we are able to execute action. And precisely because we have a repertory of action with us, and that gives us heuristics, and different kinds of things. Therefore, to see action itself as knowledge. Okay, it is not something that some idea being executed as the knowledge. And this is a true description of what European would do. Now, we have done also interesting kind of advancements. Most companies, for example, when they operate in India, they've done very interesting kind of user manuals. So if you look at most of the TV, mixer grinder, which are, very home product where multiple consumers, use these kind of products. So they have now gone into descriptions which are given in terms of pictures.
hmm,
Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. These are the aids which facilitate
hmm, hmm,
somebody who is more into practice, because if you go open left, do that, this textual descriptions may not be very comfortable,
hmm, hmm.
but then you have a very visual representation.
Right.
Then these visual representation would actually indicate how do you act. There are so many manuals that I recently encountered which actually pictorially almost depict the operating function. So many companies have been trying to do. But my complaint about this is not that I have anything against that kind of depiction. We have not done it through a proper reflection. In fact, some people have thought about it, insights they've gained. But we are unable to convert this insight into a knowledge about the nature of human action.
Mm,
Right?
mm,
So in case of European culture, there the idea of institution is fundamentally to institutionalize these principles and ideas.
mm, mm,
Right? Now, what we have is that if you see Matha as an institution, Akhada as an institution, okay, temple as an institution, we don't know whether we should see them in that way or not. But for an argument, if you see that way, what we do is that you create a condition for transmission of actions. So you don't run into this crisis of institutionalization. Okay, because then you have to then find out any number of difficulty. So there is a particular kind of thinking about institution in Europe, which is the only language that we have to talk about the world today. So, but if you look at India, look at Indian politics, for example. The way politics is managed, I mean, the most of the Western political theory that we have simply fails to understand the kind of political intervention that our people do. It simply cannot account for it. And a lot of things are learned by practice. So, therefore, this is a predominant way that we engage, and this is also an attractive way. Now, if you look at most of our modern gurus, whether you take Sadhguru or Guruji Ravi Shankar, you go to them, what do they do? For an individual, for you, they will give you Shambhavi, Sudarshan Kriya, and you create a community of people. They keep practicing it over a period of time, and the next level of practice you go and learn. If you think that you wanted to go for next level, you go and learn. So what you have is our imagination of the world is simply practice. So for us, learning Bhagavad Gita is also a ritual practice. So therefore, you should memorize it. So even writing is also a kind of practice. So we see our world in a very, very different way
got it.
than the way. So when you come to Seva organization, I mean, that is where I wanted to come back. Now, what do we want to do? See, look at, there is a disaster happening, or there is a child in the school suffering. Now, a lot of Indian people respond to this with compassion. I mean, the kind of participation that happens in volunteerism, the people who are in the volunteerism space know you can't handle the number of volunteers who come to you in the organization. They would love to do all this. Now, our legal mechanisms actually are very uncomfortable. See, any number of people I know, they come and go to various bastis and teach children. They're all IT professionals. They take break, they come. But technically, they cannot be shown as teachers. But they're very qualified, they're overqualified people. They come, they spend time, they teach. So they wanted to do that. Somebody has a mission that I wanted to educate underprivileged class. And they will go and do it no matter what you do. They create all kinds of opportunity. But the moment you create an organizational structure, they will all get into a paralytic mode.
Got it. Yes.
Right? I mean, I'm sure because of your experience with hundreds of organizations, you might reflect on that. So one of the very important departure that we must do is of two-way. Now, see, you can't wait for somebody to sit and develop a theory of how do you build an institution. Even if you build, you don't know whether it is workable or not, because we have forgotten. 200 years we have not thought about it. But one must develop such things. But in the meantime, across domains, across organization, we should start rethinking on how we encourage the transmission of practices.
Mm,
How
mm,
do we think about it? So there is this beautiful metaphor in Western philosophy called Neruta's metaphor. Now the problem is that there is this ship of Theseus,
mm.
which was in the middle of the ocean, and there was a leakage in the ship. So the challenge was whether you wanted to replace the wood plank by plank while traveling, or whether you wanted to sail to the beach and then repair it. Now imagine that you wanted to sail till the beach. Who knows, I mean, whether your ship will really reach the destination, the bank. No, we really don't know. Therefore, one of the tasks that we have at hand is to replace this ship, every plank by plank. And while doing so, someone has to have a fuller vision.
Yeah.
These are two different kind of work, technically two different kind of work, but I would see it as two phases of the same coin. One has to keep reflecting about the problem of institution, nature of institutionalization, and then we come back and say, how do we flood our organization with practice, and how do we create a teaching learning atmosphere in an employment sector or in a service sector where we create new modules for transmission of practices. At the end of the day, transmission of practices. Mind you, for example, the corona, the most successful way of we managed ourselves in India, mostly village side. Because see, they had the memory of practices. They were part of it when the plague had come earlier. All kinds of epidemics had come to their places, and the social distancing and all that was part of their memory. And what was the talk in the social media everywhere? Now, the kind of medical prescriptions that were given, were something that was part of our memory. In our childhood, the kind of hygiene that you have to maintain once you go outside the house and once you come back, irrespective of which jati you belong to, which region, there were hygiene practices, and we thought these are all superstitious. And there was an entire movement, and in my generation from 90s onwards, we have been every day brainwashed to say you get rid of these practices. And the COVID came, the couple of generation before us and my father's generation knows this practice. They have not given up this practice, and the whole India went back to this practice, and they knew how to teach and transmit these practices. Now we know I can teach this to my son because I went through. Imagine if such a thing would not have happened, we would have lost it. So therefore, what we are unable to see is this practice itself is knowledge. There is no, you can't search behind the practice knowledge and convert it to some principle, because knowledge had to be in the practice. You cannot, you can make a logical separation between the practice and the knowledge, but technically they are one and the same. You know the practice, you have the knowledge. Now, you may not be able to describe it, but you know how to do.
But that doesn't mean you don't have the knowledge.
Yeah, precisely because you have the knowledge, you execute. I mean, I might sit and give, pages and pages of bullshit by reading books. But actually, when you have to do things in the world, the practice, this is the way that Indians are, used to, function in this world. And our institutions are completely in the opposite direction because they were built for theoretical knowledge.
Yes, yes, yes.
Right. I mean, so the heart of the problem that we suffer in the organization lies in this, tension between one hand, the institutions which are migrated from Europe, which are meant for another kind of configuration of learning, and another way of my existence. It's a different configuration of learning. Mind you, but one must be clear that even when we are talking difference, now this does not mean that Europe did not have the practical knowledge. They did. I gave you already an example. The way they conceptualize practical knowledge is that is subordinated to the theory.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, our theories are subordinated to practices. That's why any Indian tradition you go back in your family, if you have grandfather, they would emphasize on anushtana, which is a very common talk in our families. You have to have a daily structured daily life. Morning you do. So there is a particular way that you have oriented. See, you can't pick a practice randomly. It requires a structured orientation. Now that is something that we must learn.
Find ways to,
and take it, and we should be able to, bring it and teach it in the modern organizational function. But of course, the larger issue is how do we deal with this laws and institution is another entirely different problem that we need to break.
Sure. Lovely. I think just to move to my last question, also just in kind of also honoring the time, and maybe the how is an entire world that you're opening up. How do we create conditions for practices to be done, for them to transmit? And I think what I'm hearing from you broadly is kind of a much deeper shift from a theory first, abstraction first world to a practice first way of being, and even transmission, like even learning. I think you're also turning learning on its head, saying don't teach theory and translate to practice, practice together, and that is the knowledge itself. You're saying there's no other knowledge. I think that's how I'm hearing, that's how I'm hearing what you're sharing. For people who are listening to this podcast, which would be typically heads of organizations or OD experts, what would you then say? Would it be how do we create conditions for practice to flourish and transfer? Yeah, like what are a few things that, using the ship metaphor, if we have to start putting a new plank, one plank at a time in place, and also hold a larger vision for a set of institutions which run by practice, what would you kind of give as pointers and recommendations?
See, one of the most compelling case for us is to develop a large number of trainers who are reflective enough to find out how do we really create a condition of transmission of practices. And once you create that, as I pointed out with the example, I can go on giving the example, but I will refrain from it. Some other time we will get into the detailed conversation on it. Now, once you know to act in certain situation, that action itself would actually help you to create new action in new situation, right? Therefore, this reflection and action. So this was my response to your exceptional crisis,
Right,
kind
the
of
action
situation.
itself, yeah,
Will generate new set of action,
yeah.
right? So in that sense, enriching a condition where we focus on practices is very important. And how would I think about it? How would I give advices to people who run organization? I have few examples where people have, some of them consciously, some of them have unconsciously done this kind of conducive atmosphere creation in organization. I mean, I would even advise some people to find out such organization, go and think about what is the idea. Now, in any management, organization thinking, you talk about the business culture, which is it is a very important point that gets explained. It is not the culture that I spoke so far. It is an atmosphere that you create within an organization. Now, how do you orient people to be part of certain, organization in such a way that they can do best, using that? And I have seen any number of people. Few examples I have in my mind. They have consciously built organization with this commitment to certain goals and through practices. So most often in those organizations, even when they talk about, they also have reflective sessions, etc. But they are done in a very traditional way. So some of them, a couple of examples which are there in my mind. No, they have come from some Guru Parampara, and they have come and they have built modern organizations. And they are absolutely, if you go to those organizations, the atmosphere, the moment you enter, you feel very positive about it. And whether somebody who is a sweeper on the floor or the housekeeping staff or a security to everybody is aligned to certain ways of acting. Now, this culture building is one of the most important aspects that we must do. And how exactly it should be done is something that we need to sit with those organizations, because different leads of the organization come from different backgrounds. Now, if you can spend some time in figuring out what is the background orientation they have, we should experimentally try out with some organization on how do we really make it enriched with the practices. Once you have that, any new challenge that you have, can be addressed because they know how to act under given situation. Now, this kind of culture building is absent almost all in all the organization. So many people, well-meaning people with the best, kind of goals, well thought out organizations simply fail because they randomly appoint people and they do not orient them, get them into commitment to an organization. The kind of HR training, the kind of OD training, the kind of staff training that you have
Hmm.
had to be reconceptualized.
Hmm.
Okay, you will still have the games being played, team building is done, all that is necessary that you have to do, but it has to be done with a different orientation, different purpose, and new modules have to be rewritten. Once we do that, now we can create sustainable organizations.
Hmm. Where there is commitment first, practice first, conditions for transmission of practice first, rather than theory first, concept first, and kind of. I
So
think that's.
then, so that the moment you take this route, you're more or less addressing the succession problem in Indian
Absolutely,
organizations.
because you're doing it together, so there is already that transmission as well, rather than creating some framework or some kind of conceptual frame. Uh, I think thank you for that. I was there is so much more there that I would love to explore, including I'll just name them and maybe we'll do another podcast. One is the power dynamics of maybe some people who are benefiting from this system. I don't know who, but there is obviously a bunch of colonized or academic people who want theory to be prominent, and they're maybe keeping those structures in place. Who knows? The other was ideas like the whole playfulness and the ideas of Nai Talim, or the ideas of actual traditions, the Gotul tradition in the Adivasis, which are all actually living examples of these, which we need to kind of revive. So I think some of those are coming to my mind. And this last thing that you said, what is a new pedagogy which puts practice first? And practice of the real thing, not practice of a simulated thing, and then kind of starts from there. What would that look like, and if it puts all of us out of work, so be it. But maybe that's the way forward, right? To say that, can we revive that? So I think uh, yeah, I'm feeling very enriched by what you're saying, Professor. And I think when I started this podcast, I was imagining it at a certain level. And I think as you shared, I think what you're sharing is several levels deeper than what I was inquiring for. I think you're inviting us into a whole new, not new, but maybe a reclaiming of a worldview itself, which is a practice first worldview. So thank you so much for opening this whole door for us, I think. And I think it's a door we can walk into and explore and recreate, reclaim as well. So just feeling a lot of gratitude. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. It's an opportunity for me to sort of consolidate, synthesize all stray independent thinking, because this is we also hardly get this time to sort of synthesize all of them and put it, because there is a practical requirement now to think about organization. I am also part of that crisis. I've been also be thinking. So therefore, it is a great opportunity. But one quick response is, I don't think any one of us who are there in this space in training and helping organizations will go out of job, but rather you will find a powerful mantra to make the job that you guys are doing in far more useful, fulfilling, and at the for the service of the organizations
Hmm,
which they are putting in money and talking to you.
hmm,
This is number
hmm,
one. The second important point is the Nagi Talim, etc. is fine. They're interesting kind of experiment. I'm not even talking about it. So I would be interested in actually focusing on most ordinary experience of every Indian. Now that is what should be brought in, because one of the problem that we have is there are islands of success which are not sustainable that have been created in 1 century.
hmm, hmm,
Now, none of them are replicable, transmittable. They are very idealized, which I mean, they are fantastic models. I mean, I'm not criticizing anything against them. They also need to be critically re-examined. But nonetheless, as Indians, Abhishek, you are as Indian as I am, both of us. And whether you are metropolitan, whether you are in village, all of us carry this element, because this is the way that we know how to go about this world. This is what we have learned through our socialization,
hmm, hmm,
culturalization.
hmm,
So therefore, this is exactly needs to be tapped in. Right? All of us have that element because this is what we know. I'm not saying this because it is Indian and therefore you should do it. I mean, this is what we know best. And so one of the best corporate strategy would be, what you are best at is something should be put into use. Now that is exactly what should be the focus. Now we will always have some islands of ideal, etc. But I am more interested in looking at very ordinary, sustainable, scalable, kind of an idea that we need to arrive at, because this is a larger problem that all of us are going through.
sure.
This is, if I create an isolated place, we are about 25 people, we do all this. I mean, it's fine. I mean, with due respect, but we are, 140 crore people in this country, and our demands and our requirements are different. So therefore, we need to, I think, reorient ourselves in that direction. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to sort of
Thank
synthesize all that we
yes.
had. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Looking forward to engaging with you more deeply on this.